So the Yellow Vests have been at it for a whole year now. Today, which is Saturday, the people in mostly Paris are celebrating the first anniversary of their movement. Although I'd imagine it has to be mostly bitter and not so much sweet, since when you have a protest movement like this, ideally it doesn't last for an entire year, because the goal of protesters, of any protest movement, is to achieve some goals, and then once those goals are achieved, they stop protesting. And so you could say that the fact that this movement's been going on for a year is a sign of its strength and how its resilience to keep marching on, and that people have not forgotten about their goals, sure. But more than that, it shows how weak and ineffectual it's been, because they haven't been able to achieve their goals and then disperse. It's just like a war. Nobody talks about Afghanistan being the longest war in American history like it's a good thing. It's understood that if you have a war that's going on for a long time, it's not a symbol of we've been able to keep up the fight for so long. That's a sign of how strong we are. No, it's a sign of how ineffectual you've been. And I don't mean to be mean to the Yellow Vests. I think that they're going up against, really terrible odds. I don't think it's necessarily their fault. I think that as far as protest movements go, their efforts have been admirable. It's just the results that really are where they're lacking. Because, despite all of the obvious, distrust and angst that exists amongst the citizenry of France, they haven't really seen substantive change in their government. Certainly not substantive change by French standards. France is a country which has had multiple uprisings since 1789. The first French Revolution. They've had many periods where the people have risen up and have done this very same thing, where they have a protest movement in Paris, and then what ends up happening is the government's forced out and a new government comes in to replace them. And this has happened pretty regularly in France up until, I guess the last one was in the 1870s, after the Franco-Prussian War. After that was put down, you didn't have any huge revolutions that overthrew the government. However, you did have, protesters that would rise up and agitate for change, and the government would recognize that, saying, we don't want to be overthrown like these previous French governments, so we're just going to acquiesce to the protesters' demands. Macron has not really done that. He's done some piecemeal stuff, but he hasn't really gotten at the core issues which are driving these protests. Because really, this is a protest movement against the French establishment in general, which, Macron embodies. Macron's whole campaign was, hey, I'm going to be a nonpartisan neoliberal centrist. He left the Socialist Party just because he wanted to attract people who support the establishment of all ranks. It was a unified establishment party, is essentially what he created, his En Marche, or however you say it in French. It's why he was called the savior of Europe by I forget which magazine, but it was a pretty common term that was being circulated around the time of his election. Because after the election of Donald Trump, people were looking at, how's Le Pen going to do in France? Because Le Pen was seen as, even though she's got a lot of baggage, she was seen generally as the anti-establishment candidate, and Macron was running overtly as the pro-establishment candidate, saying, hey, if you like, the way that your rulers have been ruling you for the last few decades, vote for me, Emmanuel Macron. He was an actual Rothschild banker. He is a caricature of the establishment. This is a man who's suggested bringing back the draft to force people into the military so that he can drill into an obedience to the state into people's heads, because of course that's your job. If you're the military, you have to swear an oath to. In France, I'm sure it's the same as the U.S. to defend the Constitution, and pretty much they drill into your head, hey, France is great, everything the government says is right, this is blah blah blah. That's what he wanted people to do. That is sick authoritarian garbage, frankly. And so that's why this, the Yellow Vest movement evolved into a protest not just against, the gas tax, him raising the gas tax, which of course was a tax on, poor people who live outside of cities, people who have to drive cars, who generally are going to be, less wealthy than the folks living in Paris who can take, public transportation or whatnot. These people wanted Macron himself and everything he stands for overthrown and gone. These are people who were, beating up the mainstream media and smashing their cameras, I think. And that's why it swelled to, as Reuters, claimed the peak was about 300,000 people. Meaning 300,000 people, protesting all in one day. That was the biggest it ever got. And it got to that point because, and it was probably bigger, because a lot of the times when it comes to these sorts of protests, they'll underestimate the numbers. Other times they'll overestimate the numbers. But it got to that point because, there is a popular angst and distaste for the current establishment. However, the Yellow-Vests at some point started to lose steam. And the protests, while they still happen every weekend for an entire year, the Yellow Vests have been out, protesting and rioting, because it wouldn't be a French protest without a substantial portion of rioters. Well, I'm not saying that to deride them. That's just what France does. You could say that's a part of French culture. It's a bit of a national tradition. Well, anyway, they were out in force for many weeks. There were people who were coming out every week. And, eventually people just got tired because nothing was changing. What they were doing wasn't working. And, the definition of insanity is, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So they kept up the protesting, and a lot of people are still keeping up the protesting. Even today in Paris. Paris is burning. And so, even though you can't say, that the fire rises at this point, the fire is at least being maintained. There is sort of this eternal flame of discontent, which is continuing in French society. And the reason, and I think it will continue, even though it's not strong enough, obviously, at this point to overturn the establishment. The fact that the establishment has not capitulated at all, that they have been strong, that they have resisted, has ensured that this protest movement will not go away. But like I said, them resisting long enough has actually deterred and discouraged enough people to the point to where, it's died down and it's become a little more fringe than it was. And so, at least in the short term, I would call that a victory for Macron and the establishment because they were able to hold out. And that's as good as they can do because, to appease these people, in order for the protests to die down and for it to disappear entirely, in order for the angst that these people feel to be alleviated, the establishment would have to go bye-bye. Because that's what we've seen in previous French uprisings. I guess the most recent example that would be analogous to this would be, like the May 1968 protests. And, of course, they're called the May 68 protests because they only really occurred in May. And that was an uprising in Paris, a very similar thing where people would make barricades in the streets, and there was lots of protesting and rioting and destruction of private property. And those, mostly college students, wanted the resignation of Charles de Gaulle, who had been president for most of their lives, the kids who were protesting. So a very similar situation to what you have with Macron here. The difference being that Charles de Gaulle at that point was a very old man. He'd been in power for a long time, and so he's just like, okay, we'll call it quits. And so they were able to push him out. Macron doesn't want to go. Macron's a young guy. He's got a lot of big vision. He wants, his European superstate. He wants to do away with the idea of France as, at least as these people see it. And so I don't think that that we're going to see the ideas of the Yellow Vests disappear. They're going to stay, but they're going to be an undercurrent. This is just going to be, I guess, become a feature of French politics now. This division between the people who hate the establishment and for those who, reluctantly or enthusiastically embrace them is, I think is well defined at this point. And, it's not going away. And just because the pro-establishment forces have the upper hand in French politics right now does not mean that everyone all of a sudden, supports the establishment. That's not true at all. So it may be next time around, when there is a presidential election, that you see some kind of an opposition presidential candidate try to appeal to the Yellow Vests. And probably will have to try and do something similar to what Macron did, but like the anti-Macron, to where Macron was the pan-establishment candidate. He's like, whether you're on the left or the right or whatever, I'm just going to be the establishment guy. There's going to be probably a successful challenger to Macron, would have to be the anti-establishment person, meaning, hey, whether you're on the left or the right, what we agree is that, these people suck and we need to beat them down. And so in order to credibly take that mantle, I think it's going to have to be, someone new, someone who isn't, considered to be a hard right person like, what's her name, Le Pen, and it certainly can't be someone who's seen as a hard left person like Jean-Luc Mélenchon. I think that's how you say his name. I'm terrible with pronouncing these French words. They're so hard to read. So even though, those people may be to their side, that are seen as good anti-establishment persons, I don't think that they're going to attract, anti-establishment voters, from the other side. In the same way that Macron was able to attract, center-right and center-left people. But of course, that's all speculation, because there probably won't be a candidate that really is able to do that anyway. But that would be my advice to someone who wants to be the president of France. Try to find a way to bridge that gap and to unite all of the people who identify with the Yellow Vest, because at certain points, the approval rating of the Yellow Vest movement was very high amongst the French population. High enough, it was certainly a majority, high enough to win a presidential election. If you truly were able to become the candidate of all the Yellow Vests, of the right-wingers and the left-wingers and all those people, everyone who agrees that the current order is suboptimal. Now, of course, if I were that candidate, I would, try and stake myself on getting power out of Paris and returning it more to localities, some sort of a federalist position, something that I think could unite left and right, because you allow the left-wingers to run their areas the way they want, and allow the right-wingers to run their areas. I mean, could you imagine if, French departments, which are very small and very localized, were operated more like U.S. states and had, their own legislatures and were highly democratized, and if you had a lot more power concentrated at that level, at the local level, than you did in Paris, well, then, I think a lot of the political tension in France would probably dissipate, because you would be, you'd have communities that had governments that were much closer to them. And of course, if you had, local legislatures at the department level, you would have a lot more representatives, per 10,000 people or whatever. Each legislator would represent a much smaller constituency. They'd be much more impacted by, the popular will and all these things. But again, France, I'm being somewhat utopian by trying to have hope for a political solution. Politics almost never works out well. Politics always seems to go in the direction of trying to rile people up and make them hate each other more and more, despite what politicians might tell you. Coexistence seems to be, what is furthest from a lot of these people's minds, if you ask me, because they're all about coexistence so long as everyone is living under their rules. They don't want to coexist with people who live by different rules in different areas. And of course, the decentralization of the French government would run counter to, the efforts of trying to centralize government in Europe in general, in the hands of the European Union. And so obviously this candidate that's trying to run on the establishment to essentially break up the monopoly on power that Paris has would have to also be a Eurosceptic candidate, at least someone who is on the level of Viktor Orban, to where they want to be sort of anti-EU within the EU, if not, be a full, Frexit proponent. And so the more I think about it, I think that there's a very good opportunity for someone who wants to run and be the Yellow Vest candidate in 2022. But of course, we're a long way off from that, and frankly, the Yellow Vest probably won't exist by then anyway. But maybe there will be some new protest movement. I doubt that after 5 years of Macron, he'll be very popular. And so with that said, if you gain anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.